Hello, my name is Dorian Lucky, and I will be introducing Group 9's video on environmental racism. Environmental racism contributes immensely to the health disparities minorities must continuously overcome to better their health. Minorities face problems in their neighborhoods that can result in extreme health conditions and the inability to receive proper medical attention because of their race or distance to healthcare services. Environmental racism has been described as the challenges minorities face, such as health conditions and inability to receive healthcare services, that has been forced onto them whether from fast food companies in the community, poor community health conditions, or poverty that prevents proper nutrition and healthcare. Group 9 plans to present an overview of the topic, environmental racism, and stats to help strengthen our argument that the source of health disparities in minority communities can be linked to environmental racism. The sociological theoretical framework will be used to describe how environmental racism is currently seen and the effects it has on minority communities. Finally, policy recommendations will be presented to help combat environmental racism and prevent it from cascading into worse problems. Two forms of racism, white privilege and white supremacy, are compared in Geographies of Race and Ethnicity 1, White Supremacy versus White Privilege in Environmental Racism Research, examining how distinct the two are and what role they play in environmental racism. Robert Bullard addresses environmental racism during an interview conducted with Columbia University's Journal of International Affairs, where he spoke about his history combating environmental racism and how the government should step in to help minority communities that face environmental racism. The Source, The Slow Poisoning of Black Bodies, A Lesson in Environmental Racism and Hidden Violence presents how environmental racism poisons minority communities, specifying that justice cannot be had while ignoring environmental racism, which are unjust environmental conditions that devalue minority communities. Environmental racism throughout the history of economic globalization writes about how environmental racism plagues history and contemporary realities of globalization, leading to a historic overview of globalized environmental racism in order to address and combat negative choices affecting marginalized communities throughout the world. In the source Spatial Formation Theory, Transcending the Race-Class Binary in Environmental Justice Literature, environmental justices, exclusively from the vantage point of socio-economic differences, are described using racism and class roles as the framework. Arguing the linkages between environmental justice and anti-displacement principles, the source environmental justice means the right to stay put, mobilizing against environmental racism, gentrification, and xenophobias in Chicago's Little Village, informs readers of community responses to multiple forms of structuralized, racialized violence. Within the source, A Policy Approach Toward Climate Justice, African Americans that are disproportionately burdened by the environmental harm, unemployment, economic hardship, and health impacts from heat waves and other weather events are presented to the reader. The source, Justice for All, published by Time magazine, speaks about how companies' waste dumpings affects minority communities and that companies need to be held responsible for the damages they are causing.
Our group decided to research the health disparities caused by environmental racism. Communities of color disproportionately face higher levels of lead exposure, higher risk of flooding, and poorer air quality from carcinogens and particulate matter exposure. This has resulted in higher risks for asthma and heart disease. With widening health and wealth disparities, Black communities have been devastated by the coronavirus pandemic this year, with unequal access to healthcare and ineffective government response. The control of space and exclusion of certain space to racial groups rests in power differentials and forms of control where businesses and industries destroy the environment and disregard the public health of citizens. One article has found that pollutants have caused low birth weights and higher blood pressure. A 2016 study from the Environment International found that long-term exposure is associated with racial segregation. Another article has found that in South Philadelphia, refineries and industrial waste plants were situated near Black communities. South Philadelphia is 60% Black, and It has some of the highest asthma hospitalization rates in the city. Climate change is worsening for Black and Brown people, and with continued environmental negligence, more people will be impacted by environmental racism and climate change.
Hello, my name is Maurice Johnson, and I will be discussing the overview and statistics of environmental racism. Environmental racism is essentially any environmental law, policy, or practice that has a negative, direct, or indirect impact on an individual, group, or community based on their race. For example, recently in the past few years, the U.S. has begun to experience impacts of climate change, such as hurricanes, floods, and forest fires. These natural disasters negatively impact Black people at a disproportionate rate. A recent study shows that African Americans were 5.8 times more likely to live in the most environmentally hazardous zip codes. This, coupled with issues such as political powerlessness, poverty, and unequal health access, will only greaten health disparities in Black communities. Another issue involving environmental racism is waste management. It is not uncommon for waste incinerators, garbage dumps, or landfill to be in any Black inner city neighborhood. A study shows that every 6 out of 8 city-owned incinerator was in a predominantly Black community. We also see this in the case of the Baltimore incinerator, which is only located 4 miles away from Benjamin Franklin High School and Curtis Bay Elementary School, which are both predominantly Black schools. Pollution of air quality in predominantly Black neighborhoods is an issue that has caused a rise in respiratory diseases in the Black community, such as asthma, sarcoidosis, and sleep apnea. Let it be known that African Americans have the highest rate of asthma among all racial groups. In all, from these examples, we can see how rooted environmental racism is in the U.S. Environmental racism is systemic as health disparities in the Black community are. Therefore, they impact one another directly. Moving forward, we can only continue to fight for what is right to help win back our neighborhoods and put an end to environmental racism and health disparities in the Black community.